All right, good evening. It is July 8th, a little early for some tropical discussion, but we do have a rather unusual situation that's about to unfold in the Gulf of Mexico. And I think it's interesting because I don't believe this is going to play like a typical July system, which is what I want to go through here because this is kind of the broader scope that interests me from this particular system. So, right, this is just a floater from Tropical Tidbits. You see a pretty disorganized system right now over Georgia, and that's the first unusual thing. It's that we have an invest over land that's going to be dropping down into the Gulf of Mexico, as seen here by the National Hurricane Center's map, which shows our low or current area of interest flanked over Georgia. That's going to be Georgia and dropping somewhere into the Gulf of Mexico. Now, before we go into that and why I think this is interesting, I want to first go over why we normally don't see July systems being that active. And to do that, I'm just going to show you the way I typically see the Atlantic. This is not the way the Atlantic is actually drawn. These are not, real scientific regions in some of them are, some of them not, but this is kind of the way I in my brain, I break the Atlantic down to 6 regions. Number one, the main development region. I may have added a little bit extra here to cut off this open Atlantic area here, but this is where the tropical waves come off Africa. This is where we look for development in August and September. 2, the Caribbean. 3, the Bermuda Triangle, Bermuda to Miami to San Juan, or pretty close to that. 4, the Gulf of Mexico. 5, I've made the immediate East Coast, which is basically everything north and west of the Bermuda Triangle, from Florida to Maine, up into the Gulf of Maine. And then this region number 6 out here is just basically open Atlantic trash that once it gets out here, we typically don't care about it because it's never going to impact mainland North America, except maybe the Canadian Maritimes up here. But these systems that get out here pretty much no longer exist. Now, or no longer are of concern to land areas. So what I think of as a general rule is that it's difficult to get really formidable systems in regions 3, 4, and 5 when regions 1 and 2 are shut down. And that's typically what happens in the month of July for 2 reasons. Reason number 1 is this. This is not today's image. This was about a couple of weeks ago, but it shows really, really well the Saharan dust. The largest desert on Earth, the Sahara in Africa, blows tremendous amounts of dust over this region, which causes the main development region, the open Atlantic and the Caribbean, to get clogged with dry air over much of the early part of the summer, from June, July. It continues sometimes in August and even September, but it really peaks in July. It starts to drop off once you flip the calendar to August. So this entire area just gets absolutely nailed with conditions, dry sinking air, conditions that are typically unfavorable for tropical development, no matter how warm the water is. It doesn't matter if the water was 100 degrees here. If you had dry air and wind shear, you're not going to get tropical development. So that's one. Number 2, and this portrays to the Caribbean in particular. This is the average wind shear map across the Caribbean by month. The 2017 figures on top of here, it shows that was an active year. You can see the wind shear gets pretty low, but the other blue line here that runs all the way through, the lighter blue line, is the average from May to December on this map. And what I've also done here is I've drawn a black line just below the 30 knot wind shear, which basically just highlight where that figure gets below 30. And the reason why this is significant is that tropical systems do not like wind shear. If there is high wind shear, you cannot get tropical systems. Again, the Caribbean stays above 80 degrees all year long, which is step 1. You think about warm water, you can get tropical systems. There's a reason why you never get tropical systems in January, February, March, April, May, and June in the Caribbean, even though it's warm enough. It's because of this. For most of the year, the Caribbean's a windy place. It does not typically see a lot of storm systems coming into this region. So for this reason, because we're not quite below that, starting to lower in July, but we're not quite below that threshold yet of 30 knots where you really start to look at where it's not hazardous for tropical systems. And of course, many times the Saharan air layer getting all the way over to the Caribbean, like it is in this picture, where it's very, very extreme, cuts off the Caribbean as region number 2. So typically, and if you know the tropical Atlantic, if you follow storms historically, most of the time, storms that end up big in these regions come from either region 1 or region 2. So it's really hard to get anything to come into those regions and be a formidable tropical system, even if the waters are warm enough in July, which they often are. However, sometimes you get a leftover frontal boundary or a leftover convection that can form in these regions. And that's what we have here, and that's why this becomes interesting. But what's even more interesting about this particular system is that it's dropping down in a fashion where it's going to turn back towards the west, as indicated here. Normally, when a system is dropped off, it will eventually move east, which, if it's off the east coast, it's not going to be any concern because it's going out to sea. And even if it forms in the Gulf, and even if it's south of Louisiana or whatever and goes east, typically when a storm is moving east in the Gulf, if it's just originating there's probably not a ridge on top of it. Now, you might get a formidable system coming out of the Caribbean later in the year, in August, September, October, that, then the trough can serve as ventilation. It can come into Florida. That's a different story. When a system is new and just trying to develop, you really need a ridge to build over the top. And what do you know? If we run, this is the European model, run it forward, we do have some sort of ridge building here by day 3. Now, exactly how big it is, where the eastern extent of it is, it's not known yet. But what we do know is this system here in the Gulf of Mexico and the European is tracking east to west. So that makes it more of maybe an August system that came in across from the Atlantic side, or something that we typically see later in the season. So we've already got a system in the Gulf of Mexico, which is more conducive of a later season event where you would see something come up out of the Caribbean or out of the open Atlantic across Florida. We have a system that's moving east to west because there might be a ridge developing over it. That's still to be seen, but possible. And thirdly, we have this. These are the sea surface temperature anomalies in the Gulf of Mexico right now. And what we really are seeing, which is really amazing, is we're seeing largely 1 to 2.5, some cases 3 degrees Celsius above average in the Gulf of Mexico. And that means that the sea surface temperatures are running about a month ahead of schedule in terms of how warm they are. So if you flip that to the actual map here in Celsius, 30 degrees Celsius, that's 86 degrees Fahrenheit. So you basically have widespread mid-80s, 29, 30 degrees Celsius, from even upper 80s. I've seen some 88, 89 degree regions over here in the Big Bend and also along the mouth of the Mississippi. So you have water temperatures in the Gulf of Mexico that are plenty conducive to support potentially significant intensification. So the reason why I go through all of this, even though it doesn't, and I'm not going through the specifics of the system yet because we don't know a lot of the specifics of the system, is that I like to look at the environment. Normally, I am a big seller on any sort of July intensification for the reasons I mentioned, because the main regions are cut off. This system, however, breaks a lot of the rules. You got a system in the Gulf of Mexico, which is very, very hard to do in July because there's typically not a lot of troughs settling over the middle of the United States. There's usually a ridge or a heat bubble over the eastern United States. You have the Gulf running ahead of schedule. I mean, it's normally pretty warm in July to begin with, but you already have these August-like temperatures, and you have a possible ridge allowing the system to move from east to west, which you usually don't see in the Gulf unless it's entering, again, from the Florida Straits or from the Caribbean. So all of those things make this situation intriguing. Now, if we look at the particulars, here is the GFS. I'm going to back it up. This is at 850 millibars. This is a lower level environment. The GFS does not really do much to develop this system. It takes this 850 millibar low, rides it along the Florida coast, finally drops it down, not until this is Wednesday night, Thursday morning, develops a little bit of a low out here, and eventually by day 4 has something just south of Louisiana. If we look at the GFS 500 millibars, this is the same model but looking further up in the atmosphere. If we go back here, we can see there's not a lot of circulation. There's not a very well-defined mid-level center up here. And even if we run it forward to day 4, you can see the best case scenario we have for a center is something ill-defined, well to the south of where we had 850, 500. 850, 500. These lows, these centers of circulation are not stacked, meaning the GFS never really develops it. So it doesn't take advantage of the system, of the environment that is presented to it. If we look at the European model, that's a little bit different. We do not have the 500 millibar vorticity on these maps. But what we do have is the 850, and it's going to get stacked enough here where you're going to see that they do get stacked, and you see a much more significant development, even by hour 48. The systems that have dropped from Georgia, have dropped south into the Gulf, are already showing signs of pretty significant organization here, and this is by Wednesday morning. So we're going to know a lot on Tuesday. Tuesday's a big day in terms of figuring out how much this gets going. But if we play this forward, it drops even further south into almost the central Gulf. I mean, it's still in the northern part of the Gulf, but it's displaced now from many land areas, and it really could get going if it gets in this area, and then eventually rides westward. Now, 72 hours. I feel like these are 24-hour increments, so 24, 48, 72. This is a good 3 days over the Gulf of Mexico. And the general rule is when the sea surface temperatures look like this, don't trust anything over the Gulf of Mexico when it's in this area, because if there's one thing we know from history, it's that these models suck at predicting rapid intensification, both over predicting it and under predicting it. I can tell you storms like Isaac back in 2012. Oh, there were so many models that were so sure we were going to have a second Katrina going into New Orleans. That system had every opportunity to rapidly intensify, never did, stayed high in tropical storm, low in Cat 1. Models totally missed. They totally overplayed the hand. Now, on the other hand, we've seen things go the opposite way, like Hurricane Harvey and Hurricane Michael last 2 years, 2017 and 2018, where we saw systems that overperformed what the global models saw, and we did see rapid intensification, particularly because they had that 48 to 72 hour window. They had that last 24 hours beyond the 48 in the Gulf, where shear was low. I mean, moisture almost is never a problem in the Gulf, and these temperatures look just like this in August in Harvey's case, and October in Michael's. So that's why I'm raising my eyebrow a little bit with this one, because I see a setup that doesn't really reflect July. So this is the European 500 millibar map, the steering currents, and this is really just going to be important to see how far west the system gets. I think this is probably the most interesting image right here at day 3. We have this big Rocky Mountain ridge over here, and the nose of it, which is kind of decaying or repositioning itself, is pushed out over the Tennessee Valley over here, Mississippi and Tennessee Valleys. And the question is, will this be able to nose out far enough to get this system tucked up underneath it? If it does, it will do 2 things. First, it will allow the system to move further west. Secondly, it will provide a nice ventilation for the storm. So you're going to see a more likely scenario where this thing intensifies. And if you really want to see that in visual form, take a look at the European ensemble. This is the European model run 51 times over. Up here we have the intensity map. So storms that get into red mean much stronger. These are significant storms. If you get down here, there's possibly Cat 2 or stronger. And if you see all those little red lines are further west. So everything that has a stronger storm makes landfall in Texas. And the reason for that is that you have more, in those scenarios, you have more ridging, which means the storm gets forced further west, and it probably is not, buffering up against the coast, and it probably has good ventilation, so there's low wind shear and there's better chances for development. So that's what I see going on here. I do not think that anybody can really make a call here at this point in terms of how much it's going to develop. I expect the National Hurricane Center to play middle of the road, which I think is the smart play. There's a lot of mesoscale things that are going to happen that are going to be very, very hard to predict one way or the other. But what I do see here is a system with an unusually high ceiling for the month of July. I don't know if it's going to hit that ceiling. I think it's way too early to make that sort of call. That's still several days away. But it is an unusually interesting scenario that I think anybody along the Gulf Coast, and especially Texas, needs to watch closely, because Texas is where the real high-end event occurs, if one does occur. All right, that's all I'm looking at for now. Just some interesting thoughts. It'll be fun tracking this over the next several days as the season is getting off to an early start.